Good evening, everyone. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the Academy, as I never tire of telling people. And I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event. For some reason, in recent years, there's been a lot of new attention to Germany in the years right after the end of World War II. And I'm thinking here, and I'm sure many of you have read Harald Jeno's best-selling book, Wolfzeit, translated into English as Aftermath, or Frank Trentmann's voluminous but brilliant Aufbruch des Gewissens, translated as Out of Darkness. They describe a time of profound depression, anger, and resentment, in some cases, liberation. But what they all emphasize is that there was less direct expression, I should say, of guilt. And together, this all made for a toxic mix and a foul era. Tonight's lecture, entitled German Reactions to Israel's Establishment, 1947 to 1949, will fill out another part of this picture as those who inherited the wreckage that Hitler left behind considered the emergence of a sovereign Jewish state, and interestingly, it was a sovereign state before Germany itself regained its sovereignty. And it was a state that would become the home for so many thousands of the survivors of the Shoah. This lecture will be presented by this semester's Carol Kahn Strauss Fellow in Jewish Studies, Derek Penslar, William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard. And I want to thank you all for joining us here on the Wannsee. This is the final of our fellows presentations for this semester, and it's a remarkable one to end on. Let me just say a word about the fellowship. It is named in honor of Carol Kahn Strauss, whose generous gift made it possible for the American Academy to establish a new endowed fellowship in Jewish Studies in 2022. I'm especially happy about this fellowship. It was the first one I brought in, so I'm proud of it. But let's not dwell on minor ego issues. The funding enables us to bring one scholar annually for a semester-long residency in Berlin. And previous recipients of this fellowship, and I know some of you were here for those lectures, were David Price from Vanderbilt in the fall of 2023 and Agnes Muller from the University of South Carolina in 2025. Many of you will know Carol Kahn Strauss, who I hope is watching and who I'm sure will watch, but she hasn't told me what she's up to. Anyway, the longtime director of the Leo Baeck Institute, she is a truly renowned figure in German-Jewish relations. She is the recipient of the Großes Bundesverdienstkreuz. It's really big, and that's why they call it Gross, and the Ellis Island Medal of Honor. I think Carol got several on the way up to the Großes Bundesverdienstkreuz as well. At the Leo Baeck Institute, she was the executive director from 1994 and international director from 2012. And under her aegis, a branch of the Leo Baeck Institute was opened here in Berlin in July of 2013. Carol made fostering of the German-Jewish relationship and continuous engagement with Germany the essence of her life's work. And I speak not only for myself, but emphatically for myself, as well as for the trustees and the staff of the American Academy when I say that we are profoundly thankful for her commitment to this institution and for creating this fellowship, which has enriched life here so much. So let me now turn to our third Carol Kahn Strauss Fellow in Jewish Studies, Derek Penslar. I should add that Derek could have been the first fellow, but he was busy that year. I called him up, and I think he was in Munich. I don't know what you were thinking, but you were already in Munich, and that's what had happened. So I know Carol was especially delighted that Derek would have this fellowship since she has known him and admired his work for many years. Derek is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History and Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard. Is the center just like on ice while you're here?
No, I'm still running it.
Oh, you are running it from here. Okay, well, I'm sorry, you're not supposed to be doing that. He is the author of many books, too many to name. His first was Zionism and Technocracy, the Engineering of the Jewish Settlement in Palestine from 1870 to 1918. Israel in History, the Jewish State in Comparative Perspective, Jews in the Military, a history which should be assigned reading because there are so many myths there. Theodor Herzl, The Charismatic Leader, Zionism, An Emotional State, and he has co-edited several books as well. He's currently working on a book, A Global History of the 1948 War of Liberation for Israel. He has taught at Indiana University at Bloomington, at the University of Toronto, at Oxford, and he's held visiting professorships at Columbia, at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, in Paris, and elsewhere. And he is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. We like Canada. And the American Academy for Jewish Research, and an honorary fellow of St. Anne's College at Oxford. He holds an undergraduate degree from Stanford, as well as an MA and a PhD in modern European history from Berkeley. He is also a terrifically generous scholar. As I mentioned, he could have been the very first. He could have been the inaugural fellow, but he has always been really generous with his suggestions about all kinds of wonderful colleagues for the Academy to help get this fellowship going. He's also been a model fellow here because he has spent so much time accepting invitations to speak all over the country that we're going to give him some extra time to finish his book. I think, is this correct that you have spoken at the Freie Universität in Berlin, the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism at the Technical University, at Heidelberg, at LMU again in Munich, at Frankfurt, at Hamburg, and even at the Central European University in Vienna, and the Bologna Institute for Policy Research, among others.
Most of those.
Yeah?
No.
We let you go to Bologna while you were here? Anyway, you've been a terrific fellow, and spreading the renown of the Academy, you have really helped us fulfill the mission. So let me just give a couple of housekeeping remarks. Derek will speak for however long he's going to speak. And after that, the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions. If you're here, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone, and one of our colleagues will bring it to you. If you're joining us via live stream, please type your questions in the Q&A part of the platform, and we'll try to get Derek to focus on that as well. Anyway, with that, it's a real pleasure to give the microphone to Derek Penslar.
Yes. Thank you, Dan, for that very kind introduction. Thank you to, there's a lot of thank yous, but I'll make it very brief. Thank you to my fellow fellows. It's been a marvelous last few months, just getting to know all of you and learning so much from all of you. And I'm very grateful. And thank you to the entire AAB staff. This is paradise for academics. I think we've all had the most amazing learning experience in the best possible environment. And Dan, we're just very grateful for everything you've done, but everyone who works with you, again, I'm just extremely grateful. So I'm going to share with you tonight, just a moment, if I can get this to work. There we go. Okay. So while here at the Academy, I have finished the research for and have begun writing a book that is called The War for Palestine, A Global History. So it deals with the global history of the 1948 Palestine War, otherwise known as Harb Palestine or the War of Independence for Israel. It has many different names, which I think tells you something about how controversial it is. The book basically argues that Palestine has historically functioned as a mirror and a magnifier. That is, it mirrors the sentiments, the perceptions, the longings, and so forth of people throughout the world, but it magnifies them because of the passion that Palestine has aroused really throughout modern history, but particularly in 1948 and then ever since. So really my book is a way of understanding why it is that the issue of Israel-Palestine, it weighs so heavily on people. And it goes back to 1948, not only because of what happened in Palestine, but also because of how it was understood in the international community and beyond in public opinion. So the book is divided more or less into three parts. The first part deals with, I'd say, the high diplomatic history of the subject, how after World War II, the Palestine question, as it was called, the United Nations referred to all foreign policy issues at the time as questions. There was the Indian question, the Czechoslovak question, there was the Greek question, there was the Spanish question, and so on. And that's a long-standing European trope of referring to domestic issues as questions, and we can think of one in particular that's relevant to my topic tonight. The sheer amount of energy and effort that the international community put into the deliberations about the future of Palestine in 1947 and beyond, I argue, set the stage for what would become a pathway of permanent intervention, which is what we're living with since 1949. Palestine is constantly on the international agenda. But then there's a second part to the book about how throughout the world, both Arab and Jewish diasporas mobilized on behalf of their respective communities in Palestine, with Arab communities throughout the world raising funds, providing volunteer fighters, Jews doing the same thing. And then the third part, which is I'll be talking about tonight, public reaction to the war, publications of churches, NGOs, the world press. I'm looking at material in 14 languages, archival material from all over the world, books that were published by journalists in and shortly after 1948. Ambitious book project. As I tell my students, do not do this if you're looking for tenure. Do this after you've written several books and you can do whatever you want. The main questions behind tonight's talk is that I'm focusing on one particular aspect, which is Germany and its reaction to Israel's establishment and the 1948 war. So the questions are, first of all, if Israel's creation had any effect on anti-Semitism in post-war Germany. It will come as no surprise to you that anti-Semitism was quite prominent in post-World War II Germany. It was documented abundantly by surveys at the time. But what no one's really asked is, but does Israel's creation have an effect one way or the other on anti-Semitism? Does it affect what Theodor Adorno didn't coin the term, but he's been associated with him, secondary anti-Semitism, the notion that it's not a traditional anti-Semitism accusing Jews of owning the media or controlling the banks or whatever, but essentially blaming the Jews for their own murder. Never forgiving the Jews for Auschwitz, I think, is the phrase that is so deeply disturbing. Second question is if Germans have felt any sense of responsibility for the state of Israel after the Holocaust. Is there any shadow or foreshadow of Angela Merkel's famous statement about Israel being the raison d'etat, or the Staatsräson, I should say. Staatsräson, I was thinking in French, sorry about that. In 2008, raison d'etat has a different meaning. And then last, what light does studying German attitudes towards Israel's founding shed on the more well-known story of Konrad Adenauer's negotiations and actions leading up to the Luxembourg Agreement, the Wiedergutmachung of 1952? So those are some of the questions I'll be asking. And let's start. I'm going to focus a lot on the press, which is a problematic source. This is, by the way, a political cartoon from Die Zeit on the partition of Palestine that I thought was actually pretty well done. The fact is that because there was no sovereign German government in 1949, you can't really use the Bundesarchiv very much, or the Auswärtiges Amt and so forth. The archival sources you have to be a little more creative when looking for sources for the period 1947, 1948. And one source is newspapers. Now, there's all kinds of questions historians ask about newspapers, like, do people even read them? And the answer is yes. There were surveys done of German readership patterns in 1948, which you'll see that there were several newspapers in Germany with large circulations. Die Welt, the largest, the Telegraph of Berlin, the Berliner Zeitung, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Berliner Tagesspiegel, and so weiter. So there's actually, people do read newspapers. And the surveys also found that a substantial majority of Germans did believe that they were receiving trustworthy information from newspapers. And you can see in Berlin itself, about 60% of Berliners read Telegraph, and only about a third read the Tagesspiegel, but that was considered to be, at that time at least, the more intellectually oriented newspaper. So it's interesting to follow what it had to say. But the point is that people did read newspapers. Now, the post-war German press is fascinating for a variety of reasons. It was very slim. There was not a lot of money in Germany for the press in 1946, 7, and so forth. Newspapers were often only 8 pages or so long. They came out 3 times at most per week, which meant, and here's the key, they had about 1 page for all foreign news, because the rest of it had to be devoted to domestic news and, of course, sport. I mean, what could be more important than sport? So, and there's lots going on in the world at the time. In 1948 and thereabouts, you've got the Chinese Civil War, the partition of India, the Indonesian struggle against the Netherlands, the Greek Civil War, and more. So if Palestine is covered, and if it's covered in depth, that's going to mean something, because there's an awful lot of other things that the newspapers can write about. Also, are they going to devote their own correspondents, of whom there weren't many, to certain subjects, or just use wire services? So that balance between news and commentary is very important to keep in mind. And the fact that the Allies insisted after the war that to get a license, because newspapers had to be licensed, that they have to have a strict separation between news and commentary. The idea being that German democracy had been fatally weakened by newspapers in which political opinion masqueraded as fact, something that I'm glad does not characterize the American press to this day. So let's talk a little bit about the Tagesspiegel. What I was surprised to find, and again, I think when you're a historian, you go in with questions, not with hypotheses, because you never know what you're going to find. I was shocked to find that for weeks on end, news from the front, as it were, in Palestine, was on the front page, which is where der Tagesspiegel did its foreign news, of the Berliner Tagesspiegel, also the Berlin Telegraph, weeks and weeks on end, particularly from the time of the partition resolution in the United Nations, when the United Nations voted to partition Palestine between Jewish and Arab states. So that's end of November of 1947, for several months thereafter. And then particularly after Israel declared its statehood in the middle of May, there's a period of about a month where every day there is significant coverage, albeit from wire services, but significant coverage. And again, if you're covering Palestine, there's something else that's not going to get covered. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. What's very strange, though, is that although the coverage was massive, there was very little commentary. And when there was commentary, it was almost painfully neutral. So here we have an example of one of the very few editorial pieces on Israel, right on the day of Israel's establishment, from Telegraph. And you can read this. It's like really not saying much of anything. Has a vast grave opened at the foot of Mount Lebanon, which will silence desperate hopes once again for centuries. It's basically saying nothing. It's not taking any stand, any position. And that's interesting, the combination of extensive reportage and very little willingness to make any statement of any position. Okay, now what's going on? In Germany, the press after World War II was, of course, closed to former Nazis. The Telegraph was edited by former socialists, Arnold Schulz, Paul Löbe, Anna-Dore Leber. But the German Social Democratic Party after World War II did not have the warm attitudes towards Zionism in Israel that, say, characterized Italian socialists or French socialists. In France, you had the myth of not the myth, the reality of Jews and the resistance and so forth, but very little of that in Germany at the time. In the case of the Tagesspiegel, the editors of the Tagesspiegel were themselves moderate liberals. 2 of them had been in inner immigration during the war. One had worked for Nazi-approved publishing houses, but again, was certainly not directly involved in any pro-Nazi activity. So we have people whose political positions were, I think, somewhat moderate, very different, I'd say, in terms of views on Israel than the communist press. And the communist press was absolutely adamant everywhere in the world, Argentina, Mexico, New York City, Berlin, that as soon as Andrei Gromyko made his famous speech in the UN in May of 1947, that that the Soviet Union stood behind the creation of a Jewish state should a federated state not work out, the communist papers just switched on a dime. So you see this where newspapers that have been steadfastly anti-Zionist just immediately argue that Zionism is the greatest weapon against Western imperialism. And the Berliner Zeitung, which is read only by about a fifth of Berliners, is staunchly pro-Zionist. But not only that, the founding editor, Rudolf Herrnstadt, was the only newspaper editor I came across in Germany at the time who would openly criticize German anti-Semitism. And he would feature, there were some interviews with Jewish figures, and he would openly talk about ongoing anti-Semitism in German society. Again, a much more difficult issue, and frankly, if someone here knows about Rudolf Küstenmeier, the founder of Die Welt, this is before it becomes a Springer paper. Right? We're talking about 1947 here, 1948. This is a man who had been in the resistance during the war, who was deeply committed to the state of Israel, and who was actually the first full-time and permanent German correspondent in Tel Aviv from the late 1950s onward. So a man who has great commitments to Israel, and yet the coverage, again, very factual, very little in the way of editorials. There's just one editorial, again from the 20th of May, so shortly after Israel is established, very vague, lots of passive constructions about the majority of the Jews were annihilated, indescribable suffering reigned among the survivors. There rose a wave of sympathy, not clear who is sympathetic, someone is, and the idea of a Jewish homeland profited from this. Probably not the best language if you're trying to sound sympathetic. So there's an interesting disconnect then between personal feeling and a certain caginess or caution in reportage. And then there's the exception. Marion Gräfin von Dönhoff, many of you who know about German journalism know about her, Grande Dame of German journalism, eventually editor of Die Zeit. She began her career as a foreign affairs expert, a Middle East affairs expert, writing about, among other things, Israel in Die Zeit. She did not disguise her contempt for Zionism or for Israel, as she wrote in this essay, Völkische Ordnungsstaat Israel, basically calling Israel a continuation of Nazi Germany by other means. That is when she wasn't saying that the displaced persons in the camps in Germany and Austria, when she wasn't talking about how they were communists. So she was anti-communist, but she also believed that Israel was, as she wrote, a völkisch state going down a path which only recently led another people to their doom. So basically she's saying that the state of Israel is heading towards the same tragic fate as Nazi Germany. She herself was a conservative. She was born into a Prussian Junker family. She did not like Jews. She didn't like Nazis either. But she really believed that, or she compared the state of Israel more than once to Nazi Germany. So she did not hide her feelings. And as she said, when Israel was admitted to the United Nations, she described Israel as a synthetic nation, melded together out of inhabitants of the ghettos and concentration camps, a people who lacked a common history. I can tell you this, having taught Jewish history for 40 years, there actually is a Jewish common history, but she didn't believe in it. Yearning and brutality, myth and violence, and so on have worked together to recreate a state and people out of 1,000 sundry shards. She even dismissed the revival of the Hebrew language as frantic. I don't think she knew a word of Hebrew and knew nothing about this. By the way, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the famous fin de siècle anti-Semitic writer, said the exact same thing. He said, Jews are incapable of reviving Hebrew. They cannot speak Hebrew. I mean, if he'd actually gone to Palestine, he would have heard Jews speaking Hebrew, but he knew better. And she even compared the practice of Jewish politicians in Israel, Hebraicizing their names, to fascist practices. So her views were quite strong. One of the really interesting figures, and here's my last major German press figure I'll talk about, is Rudolf Augstein, who was the founding editor of Der Spiegel, a man who described himself as a glühender Nationalist, as a fervent nationalist, but who also was extremely critical of Germany's recent Nazi past. The obsession in Der Spiegel with Israel was obvious from the start. You see how in 1948, Israel was covered in 29 issues, as opposed to 20 for China, 12 for Greece, 7 for India, and 5 for Indonesia. And Israel was covered, you can see the cover photographs, heroic Jewish men and women with guns, fighting, and so forth. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. David Ben-Gurion is described as basically looking like a woodcut of the Jewish prophets by medieval masters, so this kind of biblical fantasy that the Israelis are essentially Israelites, right? That they are recreating a biblical format. And with all of the philo-Semitic language about Jews, there's also quite hostile language about Arabs. In Der Spiegel, there was one Arab leader they liked, Fazi al-Kokhaji, who was the commander of the all-volunteer Arab Liberation Army, commanded out of by the Arab League. As Der Spiegel wrote, he had a lot of things going for him. He was blonde, slim, light-eyed, spoke English well, spoke German well, and he had a, quote, pretty Berlin wife. So this all endeared him to Der Spiegel. However, the Arab Liberation Army itself, Der Spiegel wrote, was filled with basically flotsam and jetsam from the Nazi regime, mercenaries, adventurers, unrepented Nazis, along with really a rogues gallery of phalangists, Bosnian Muslims, Swedish Nazis, and so forth. The magazine even claiming there were 30,000 people in this Arab Liberation Army. The actual number was about 4,500. The single largest point of origin for them was Syria. So this is really largely made up. But they, like Jewish newspapers at the time, quoting from the Jewish Emigre Journal Aufbau in New York, quoting that these people were murderers in uniform, basically designed to, by destroying Israel, to destroy the Jewish people. So, and by the way, if any of you are into German historiography for this period, one of these articles that really was filled with misinformation was written by Heinz Höhne, who was a major figure in post-war German journalism and wrote some of the important early books on the SS and other aspects of the Nazi state. So he was a serious historian, or became a serious historian. You see, actually, it's Heinz Höhne, I'm sorry, who writes this depiction of Amin al-Husseini, the head of the Arab League, the Palestinian national leader, claiming, as has been claimed many times since, that Hitler and Husseini actually collaborated on the Holocaust, that Husseini allegedly knew about the gas chambers and so forth, that Husseini worked closely with Adolf Eichmann. This is not true, but the article wrote that the Mufti was dreaming of leading a renewed caliphate, a Mohammedan Grossreich. So the use of Nazi language to delegitimize an Arab leader. Now, what's going on here? Right? What is happening here? Well, it's an interesting question. So I can't prove it, but I'll suggest something. If you link Nazis with Arabs, you're accomplishing a couple of rhetorical goals. One is you're removing Nazis from the rank of civilized European peoples, which means if you're criticizing the Nazis, like people in the Spiegel are, you're essentially saying, we are the good Germans, we're untainted by the virus of Nazism, we are the natural heirs to the legacy of Germany, right? So there's two Germanys, we're the good guys, they were the bad guys, but you also reduce Arab hostility to Zionism, to nothing but gratuitous hatred. No mention Palestinians are a people, they have interests, they have rights. Yes, it's wrong to deny the Jews a state, but let's try to understand where they're coming from. No, it's just blind and irrational hatred. So that preserves the morality of creating a Jewish state. And why is that so important? Because as we're going to see, one thing Germans really agreed on in 1948 is they wanted a Jewish state because they wanted the Jews to leave. Right? They really wanted the Jews to leave. And so we have to believe that it's going to be a moral enterprise. Der Spiegel even made this kind of claim regarding Haganah fighters. And let's look at the language. So here's an article in Der Spiegel about Haganah fighters who are now in Munich visiting displaced persons, so Jewish Holocaust survivors in the displaced persons camps in and around Munich. So note the language. The Jewish men bear a blue shield on the sleeve of their altered black Wehrmacht jackets. So they're wearing Wehrmacht jackets, and their khaki trousers are from the Afrika Korps. So they've basically taken certain aspects from Nazi Germany, but now they've improved it and they've purified it because they are now creating a Jewish state. However, do not be fooled. Der Spiegel also had anti-Semitic language aplenty, particularly about the DPs. So here's an article from 1948 about the notorious refugee ship, the SS Exodus. After a grueling and protracted ordeal, there were people from that ill-fated ship who found themselves eventually in the state of Israel. And as the article writes, many of the women today wear gold rings. They're manicured, made up, and banknotes pile up in their husbands' briefcases. That's just a tad anti-Semitic. And they note Tel Aviv is described as containing the concentrated financial power of world Jewry. Not true. Not true at all. So there is definitely an anti-Semitic edge to it. But what is going on is, I think, a claim that Israel, in a strange way, embodies the best and brightest of what Germany itself had to offer. As Der Spiegel writes in 1949, the Israelis have become the Prussia of the East. And they're proud of this. It's like, look what we've done. We don't talk about the Holocaust, don't talk about the horrors, but talk about how Israel becomes a kind of advanced force of German culture. As I say here, a chance to repurpose guilt in watching a people undergo a massive change from a people of peddlers and merchants into a proud fighting people. It really seems to be that this allows Germans to fulfill a kind of neo-colonial fantasy. It's a kind of a Drang nach Mittelosten, as it were. Germany itself failed in its colonial dreams, but basically Israel will succeed where Germany failed. And this is a fantasy, but a very powerful one that you see even on a granular level. So getting away from Der Spiegel for a moment and just looking at a kind of a middle of nowhere newspaper, the Westdeutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, in December of 1948, there's an article about Israel, Die neue Generation ist blond. And you can see here what they claim, that the Palestine-born Israeli youth embodies a new type, outwardly apparent, right, exceptionally tall, big, blonde hair, blue eyes, right? And they have worked in their young Israeli army, and they use the word Wehrmacht. And there are other words for army in German, even then. One day they will have the deciding word. So there is a philo-Semitic element here, but it clearly is a philo-Semitism that is extremely complicated, that is, we'll talk about the psychological aspects of this more at the end. But now that's the press, and one can say, well, the press tells you what the authors of the newspapers have to say. And we know that people read the newspapers, but we don't know if they believed it, and we don't know what they made of it, and that's true. That's true. Newspapers tell you what someone thinks you might want to read. It doesn't necessarily tell you what you think. So let's look at public opinion surveys. So the OMGUS, Office of the Military Government, United States, carried out some 200 surveys of the German population in the years immediately after World War II. And 2 of them dealt with anti-Semitism. And there are many scholars who have pored over these 2 surveys. And they find that about half of Germans have anti-Semitic views, about half don't. But only about 6% in these surveys are what they would call, in the English language surveys, demonstrably friendly to Jews. In other words, there's a lot of discomfort with Jews from the German population. But there's another survey that I came across. I think this was my first week here, and the librarians were very happy for me because I'd heard about it, and I thought, oh, maybe they won't be able to find it. This big, thick book that showed up in my pigeonhole from the Institut für Demoskopie in Allensbach, a survey of anti-Semitism in Germany, very well done for the social scientists in the audience. 2,000 people are surveyed. They're divided by province, education level, socioeconomic status, religion, political affiliation, gender, I mean, everything, okay? And there's lots of charts and graphs, and it's very helpful. And yes, it shows you that Germans were anti-Semitic. But the interesting thing is what comes at the end. There's questions about Israel at the end. And I had never seen this before, and this is why this survey is so interesting. Now, about the survey, it was done by Elisabeth Noel Neumann, the founder of this Institute for Demoscopy. She herself is famous as a pioneer of German survey research, but she was also notorious for her connections with Nazi organizations. She was never a party member, but she did work for Goebbels' propaganda ministry during the war, and her doctoral thesis, which was written about public opinion survey research in the United States, just contains overtly, flat-out anti-Semitic language about Jews controlling the media and the banks in America and so forth. So she was truly an anti-Semite. But this is actually an advantage if you have an anti-Semite create public opinion surveys, because she's going to phrase questions in such a way that it's going to bring out the opinions of people who might otherwise be ashamed or afraid to speak. So the last question on the survey was, do you consider the establishment of the State of Israel to be a solution to the Jewish question? It's an amazing question because it assumes either her the assumptions herself, or that the participants just assume that Jews constitute a Frage, right? A Judenfrage, that Jews constitute a question or a problem, as opposed to the Germans who persecuted them and murdered them. So when you ask the question that way, you are going to get a wide range of answers, including hostile ones. So she got 2,000 answers, and the survey results are actually pretty frightening. In terms of the number of people who said, well, the problem is, or at least just from the quantitative data, the establishment of the state won't solve the Jewish problem. Jews will never live peacefully among us. But what's interesting is that those 2,000 people, at least some of them were also given, they were all given the opportunity to write answers. And all of the responses were recorded. It's about 130 people wrote comments. Now, it's only 130, but this is a lot more opportunity than we usually get to actually understand what some ordinary people think about an issue. So many of us work with elites. We work with cultural elites, political elites, newspaper journalists, authors. How often do we get to just talk to, non-elite people? And there are historians who will work away because they find a memoir, right, written by somebody who was not from an elite circumstance. So it's really a very interesting set of responses. So there are those who say, yeah, I think the establishment of the State of Israel will do some good. It'll help solve the Jewish problem. But then what do these people then write in their answers? Well, it's against Jewish nature. They don't want to live together. Who would do the work? They won't be able to bear not to have non-Jews to cheat. That's a very common anti-Semitic idea. That goes back to Eugen Döring. In his anti-Semitic writings of the 1870s and 80s, he writes that if there were a Jewish state, they would all just cheat each other. Right? That's a very common anti-Semitic argument. The Jews will never stay put. The disproportionate business savvy of the Jews will never disappear. They won't be able to stand each other. You can just see that as this goes on. And then they will not limit themselves to a state. They have further goals. Right? So, and this is from the people who say that, yes, establishing a Jewish state will solve the Jewish problem. Those are the people who are optimistic. What about those who are not so? Well, actually, it's very similar. The comments from people who say, well, establishing a Jewish state won't help much. The rich Jew millionaires of America will hardly go there. They would rather do business with us. The Jewish people will always be an irritant. They should have their country. They have a right to life, but not among us. Just get rid of them. It depends if they really stay there. There's this fear that they won't really go to a Jewish state. They won't stay there. And then, it really is quite stunning to read these comments, because you read comment after comment. Simple, get out. They should, cheat each other. We want nothing to do with them. Get out. and so forth. And it's interesting how many of the people here are talking about Jews cheating each other. So it just proves that many of these ideas, by the way, were rooted in popular discourse well before the Nazi period. Obviously, they were central to German political rhetoric during the Nazi period. But whether these views originated before 1933 or after, they're very powerful. And by the way, I was looking for trends. Like, are the people who tend to say more hostile things about Jews disproportionately male versus female or female versus male? Less educated versus more educated? Levels of income, wealthier or less wealthy. I looked at all the variables, and I just didn't see that much of a difference. You would have, a farm wife from Thuringia, and you would have a lawyer from Hesse. And the only thing I noticed, and you see this in the quantitative data, is that people in Berlin tended to express fewer anti-Semitic comments than people from outside of Berlin. And it seems to be correlated strongly with how well they knew Jews. Because one of the questions earlier in the survey is, how do you actually know Jews? And in Berlin, it was like 90% of the pool said that, we know 5 or more Jews or something like that. So the survey results are pretty grim. There are some exceptions. There are a few people who believe that the Jews can live peacefully with Germans, that there should be understanding between peoples. They should stay here if they want. There's no other way but tolerance. There's even a reference to Lessing, to Gotthold Ephraim Lessing and his play Nathan der Weise, Nathan the Wise, with its famous parable of the 3 rings, which is a parable of religious tolerance. So somebody had read Lessing. So that's very nice. However, most of the people who believe that Jews can be somehow rendered educable or rendered acceptable believe that Jews must undergo a significant process of, to use an old term, I think Michael Leslie is here, of bürgerliche Verbesserung, of civil improvement in the 18th century sense of the word. They must be educated to not incur our animus. They should behave decently, the idea being that they don't already. Harness the Jews in the country as England and the US have successfully done. So, right, because the US is run by Jews and Jewish financial power, that's the myth. So basically put the Jews to work in Germany to save the country from its miserable economic position after the war. It's interesting how many of the survey results, respondents talk about a territorial solution. They think Israel's too small. Every now and then, 2 or 3 times, someone mentions Palestine belongs to the Arabs. That is not common. But there is a pretty strong notion that Palestine's too small. So give them Australia, or settle them in America or Russia. They should receive a territory like the Indians. Give them forest land to clear in unpopulated open spaces in America. So this notion that Jews must leave Germany, they need to go to some large, distant space. And then finally, there's just random comments throughout expressing levels of hostility even greater than what we've talked about so far. They should hang the dregs. That would be the right solution. I put a shovel and pickaxe into their hands, so the anti-Semitic notion that Jews are incapable of constructive labor. To the moon with them. Absolute isolation from all other peoples. So this is pretty grim. I just want to mention the last 2 here: expel them to the desert and set them up in ghettos. So this is now 3-4 years after the war, and these are the way at least some people are responding to the establishment of the State of Israel. The establishment of the State of Israel, regardless of if people said it would solve the Jewish problem or not. Clearly, these people who have written responses, very few of them believe that the State of Israel will have any beneficial effect on the Jews or on the world. And if you look at the aggregate data from the survey as a whole, it's very similar to the OMG-US survey. Well over half of Germans surveyed in the 1949 survey are explicitly anti-Semitic. Only about 6 or 7% could be seen as judenfreundlich, as the term was used in the survey. It's pretty grim. So what does this then tell us about Germany after World War II? What does it tell us in general about anti-Semitism? And what does it tell us about the way that people react to the establishment of the Jewish state, which does represent perhaps the most revolutionary event in the history of the Jews in the last 3 centuries? One is that there is a very weak correlation between anti-Semitism and any one particular attitude towards Israel. That is, one can be an anti-Semite and hate Israel. There's an awful lot of that in the world today. One can be an anti-Semite and be skeptical of Israel. We've seen a lot of that in the public opinion data. But one can also be an anti-Semite and, at times at least, endorse the creation of the state to get rid of the Jews. And that is an idea that goes back in the history of anti-Semitism to the time of Theodor Herzl in the 1890s. There was a famous Hungarian publicist and journalist who corresponded with Herzl and basically said, "This is a great idea. You're going to get the Jews out of Europe. What could go wrong?" So depending on the situation, anti-Semitism can lend itself to many different kinds of attitudes towards Israel. I saw this personally when I was lecturing in Budapest some years ago at ELTE. It's a large public university in Budapest. And back then, the Jobbik party was in power, so this was kind of a predecessor to Fidesz. And a couple of young men wearing T-shirts showing pre-Trianon Hungary were saying, "Wow, we really like Israel. We don't like Jews, but we like Israel." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, it's a fortress state, and it fights against its nations, and so it fights against its enemies, and it's a fortress state." So anti-Semitism as such can lead in different directions. Another is that we see an origin here, just after the war, of a phenomenon that would develop in Germany decade after decade, and that has not entirely disappeared today. And that is the phenomenon of what is sometimes, I think, incorrectly called philo-Semitism, which means liking Jews, but is much better described as allo-Semitism, a term coined by Arthur Sandauer, but popularized by Zygmunt Bauman. So he gets the credit for it, the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. He did not make it up. Somebody else did. But the term allo-Semitism refers to the otherness of Jews. And this is so obvious in the German political discourse of the time. It's not simply a question of disliking Jews or of liking them. It's of seeing them as categorically other or different, a problem to be solved, perhaps through benign means, perhaps through more forceful, aggressive, and malevolent ones. And that, of course, is an ongoing issue in how Israel is perceived throughout the world. That is, to perceive Israel as one country in a world of some 200 countries, aggressive, militant, it invades, it gets invaded, it occupies other people. There are, unfortunately, many countries in the world that do such things. But the centrality of Israel in the global imagination, all of this really is on full display in 1948, and it's on display in in Germany as well, but in a rather odd way, which I'll get to in just a second. I just want to make, before I get to the rest of the world, just a final comment about Germany. In a 1952 survey, so that's 3 years later, well over a third of respondents would like to see Jews leave Germany. So it's not like those qualitative bits of evidence that I read to you in the last few minutes. It's not like they don't speak for a substantial number of people. Here we now see 37% of Germans would like to see the Jews get out. 34% are classified as anti-Semitic, an improvement somewhat from 1949. 23% as tolerant. I'm not sure tolerance is what we should be striving for. Maybe we want something a little better than tolerance. And only 7%, that same number that seems to survive year after year, are definitely friendly towards Jews. A third still approve of Hitler as a leader. And more than half say they never heard or knew nothing about Nazi crimes. So that's obviously they're trying to conceal their own awareness and their own guilt. But the long tail of anti-Semitism in Germany is clear from the surveys from the 1950s. And this helps explain some of the difficulties that Konrad Adenauer faced when he was negotiating the Wiedergutmachung agreement, the Abkommen with the state of Israel, in that at the time the reparation agreement was announced, only 11% of Germans approved of it fully. And another 24% believed it was in principle just. That is, in principle, Germany could make an agreement with Israel, but people were unhappy about the amount of money that Germany was going to provide. And there's many biographies of Adenauer. I was just looking through the most recent, the short, very well-written biography by Norbert Frey, in which he talks about how Adenauer is well aware of the German public he's dealing with. And so how when he talks about reparations to Israel, he has to always be talking about Vertriebene from the East. He has to be talking about the prisoners of war from the East, the German civilians who have suffered so horribly. He knows his public. And I think that the survey data, particularly the heartfelt and candid expressions that we saw, really help explain what Germany was, or what the German political elite was dealing with at the time. But now a final comment about comparisons between Germany and other countries. So in 1947-48, as I write in most of the book, which is not about Germany, Israel is discussed and debated openly, whether you're looking at the press in Argentina or Colombia or Mexico or Canada or France or China or India, wherever. Israel is discussed and debated openly, and people express strong sympathy for Israel or strong antipathy. They don't cover it up. In the case of Germany, it's obviously more circumscribed. Israel is complicated. It is a reminder of German crimes, but it also provides that opportunity for a form of redemption, that in a way Germany has continued in the state of Israel. And I know what that can be read to mean, and I do not mean in any way that the state of Israel was a continuation of Germany. But I believe, I can see why certain Germans wanted to believe that. In other countries, views of Israel mirrored national interests and self-perceptions. That's true everywhere. But people would just come out and say it. In Mexico, the foreign minister of Mexico just comes out and says, well, the Jews suffered, but we sympathize with the Palestinians because of what we lost in 1848 to the Americans. We lost Texas. That's the term he used for that 2/3 of Mexico that was handed to the United States under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. So he says, we know what it's like to lose our territory. So we're seeing it through our eyes. And he just came out and said it. And the same sort of thing in countries all over the world. In Germany, the relationship is much less direct. It deals with a people who are immersed in a kind of darkness and a struggle that they have not even begun to come to terms with themselves or their past, let alone think about a way forward into the future. So in some ways, the German case about reactions to Israel, and it has certain commonalities with other countries elsewhere in the world, but the fact that Germany was the instigator, the Vollstrecker of the Holocaust, and that Germans were very much, or at least many of them, members of a Mordvolk, of a murderous people. This is something that weighed heavily. And it's seen in the rather tortuous reportage, both quite extensive, but also rather circumlocutory, and also in the public opinion results that we saw. So thank you very much. So people get the microphones, and you're going to, okay.
Hello, that was, is this working? That was amazing. That was amazing. Three things struck me as I listened to you. Those survey responses were very striking. The first thing that hit me was that they sound a lot like the sort of thing you see on Elon Musk's Twitter. It's almost word for word the same sort of talk you see.
Yeah.
Secondly, I was also struck by this idea that the Jewish people would not be able to govern themselves.
Yeah.
And that made me think of the same sort of discourse around the Haitian Revolution that still continues to this day. A very similar kind of,
that's a good point.
And thirdly, there's this New York Times bestseller by Molly Crabapple. Yeah. About the Jewish Labor Bund. Mm-hmm. Are there any possible connecting threads there, or is there any thing you could say about that?
But I think you're making a good point about, first of all, what has social media done but allowed people to do what they've always done, but in an infinitely, infinitely greater extent and with absolutely no filters. But you're right that this was a rare moment where people were allowed to actually express their hostilities, not in the privacy of their home or with their friends, but in a kind of a public, as it were, anonymous public setting. As far as the critique of an inability to govern oneself, that's the classic colonial critique of the colonized people. And there's quite a literature on Jews as a colonized people in European history. They have an intellectual elite, just like you have a colonial elite in whether it's colonial India or Indochina or whatever. They're able to go so far, and then they hit a glass ceiling. They try to absorb and adopt the values of the colonizing society. In the end, they can only, they're only accepted so much. And at a certain point, those colonizing intellectuals usually wind up associating with revolutionary movements, rebellions. But the colonial response, you can't govern yourself. You're not politically mature. What's interesting is that the notion of Jews as communists, it did appear, we saw briefly in Marion von Dönhoff, that the Jews are communists. That certainly was a common anti-Israel and to some extent anti-Semitic critique just after the war. It was global. You see it in the United States. I mean, the State Department and the CIA routinely are writing in 1947 that the Jews in Eastern Europe were overwhelmingly communist, or many of them were communist, and that the DP camps are full of communists. And that the state of Israel is run by communists. I mean, they couldn't really distinguish between the rather moderate labor Zionism of David Ben-Gurion, who he was just a European social democrat, but they just tarred them all with the brush of Bolshevism. But that particular argument is not as dominant in what I've been talking about now. Is I'd say some more traditional anti-Semitic notions. They don't work. They control the banks. Right? They cheat. They have business acumen. So whereas the Bund stood for, yes, it was a revolutionary, socialist, Jewish organization. But I don't think the people in that survey knew a lot about the Bund. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I was struck by you showing us a couple of examples from the perception of Germans of the Palestinian Arab side, which make a lot of sense to me, the way that they were portrayed. Mm-hmm. But it does seem that if there is nothing else, there even isn't a sort of German Orientalism or anything else that connects to the Palestinian Arab side or Islam or anything of that type. Where does the German presence in Palestine from the 1850s onwards, all the Templars, the German explorers, the cartographers, and so on, where does that disappear to? Is that completely swallowed under the more recent history of the 1940s?
Right. It's a great question. It doesn't show up. Remember that the news is wire services. So this is what happened yesterday. There's the occasional feature piece. I talked about them, and I didn't talk about every single feature piece, but I talked about the most interesting ones. No, that German connection with Palestine is not talked about much. The only time what I do see is a broader engagement with Germany, Weltpolitik, and the Arab Middle East, and that's in Marion Dönhoff's writings. I didn't talk about it just now, but she has opinion pieces where she talks about the kind of the geopolitics of the new Middle East and the historic role of Germany and so forth. So she talks about it in generalities. And the only thing that she says about Palestine in that regard is the state of Israel is a problem because it's a wedge that divides the Arab world and prevents the formation of a new kind of Arab Lebensraum, living space. But no, the specific German interests in Palestine are not mentioned, even though there is a fair amount of writing around Christmas time. There's a fair amount of writing in the German press about Jerusalem and about the churches in Jerusalem, but not necessarily, the German church, like the Lutheran church, was it the Church of the Redeemer in the Old City? They're talking about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for the most part. So they're not really engaging directly with German interests in the Holy Land. I don't see very well, but I think I see a hand back there. Yeah.
Well, thanks for your thought-provoking insights, first of all. I'd like to raise the issue of guilt.
Sure.
Not Jewish guilt, but German guilt.
Yeah.
And in the literature, you sometimes find that descriptions of many Germans in the post-war period being kind of overwhelmed by guilt. And you also describe that they somehow try to conceal this guilt. And there's, however, also mentioned that a new type of anti-Semitism emerged in this period called the Schuldabwehr Antisemitismus. Right. Did you find indications in your studies for this?
Well, absolutely. And that's this notion of secondary anti-Semitism that I referred to is very much in that vein. In other words, there's different ways of dealing with guilt. That is, guilt is a feeling that might be fully conscious, partially conscious, or largely unconscious. But guilt is an awareness that one has committed a grave misdeed that violates your own personal moral code. It suggests you can't feel guilty if you have no moral code. You can feel shame without having a moral code, because shame is much more based on sort of external characteristics of status and so forth. Now, even if we have the personal statements of some individuals who wrote about how anti-Semitic they are, even if we have evidence from the newspapers about what certain people feel about the creation of Israel, it's very hard to get inside someone's head. And this is the problem that historians have, why historians generally write about aggregates, or they write about elites. They write about elites who poured out their thoughts so that we can follow them in great detail. One can be guilty or feel a certain amount of guilt without consciously being penitent. I have sinned, I have wronged, and I want to repent. That's one way of dealing with guilt. What we're talking about tonight is guilt in the sense of an unacknowledged and unprocessed, dim awareness of having committed a grievous act, but being unwilling to recognize it, let alone try to atone for it. And then that's what creates the hatred of the object of your hatred, or the object of your previous hatred. So you blame the Jews for their own deaths. You say the Jews deserved it. You say the Holocaust didn't happen, but it should happen again, which, by the way, that contradiction is a very important component of contemporary Holocaust denial. All of these factors are at work, I think, in Germany after 1945. And going back to Frank Stern in his work in the 1980s, I think, or the 1990s, through, Rainer Erb and Werner Bergmann and their work in the 1990s. I mean, there's a long heritage of literature about secondary anti-Semitism in immediate post-war Germany, of simply not being willing or able to face up to what one has done, and therefore simply hating the object, the persecuted object, all the more. Hannah Arendt also wrote about it as well in the late 1940s. Yeah, I can't see the hand. Oh, there we go.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the lecture and the really great facts that you told us today. I have two questions about the survive. You told that in Berlin, a very, very high anti-Semitism was found.
No, it was relatively low in Berlin.
The low,
Relative.
okay, that's
Relative.
okay.
Yeah.
Because in Berlin is the city where the most numbers of Jews survived.
Right.
Professor Tuchel says over 1,500, really, but you can imagine that more than these numbers.
Right.
And the second question is about the language, the speech. The question was really just like the language which was used in the Wannsee conference. Yes?
Yeah, die Judenfrage, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so yes, I mean, anti-Semitism, according to this survey, as I mentioned, people in Berlin, in general, the rates of anti-Semitic sentiments were less common, and it seemed to, again, I can't prove anything, I can just provide correlations. It seemed to be correlated with the fact, well, one is political orientation, and the other is they just simply knew more Jews. And yes, the language of that survey is classic Nazi language. There's no question about it. And I can't see, there's hands way in the back. Now I can see.
Yeah, I'm just really fascinated by this survey.
Yeah.
And I kind of have two. Were there any non-Germans or Jews that filled out this survey, to your knowledge? And also, is there anything else? There was one comment about Germany was good until 1918 because of the Ostjuden.
Yeah.
Was there anything else about Ostjuden versus like Stadtjuden that you found in that survey?
So I actually wrote and translated every single comment I've written down. They're not, I mean, though I produced a lot of them, I didn't reproduce all of them here, but I have all of them in my notes. Yeah, the Ostjuden are mentioned once or twice. I mean, there was that comment, which I thought was representative. As far as we know, I mean, from the data where they talk about every single aspect, demographic aspect of the people whom they're interviewing, they are all Deutsche Staatsbürger. They're all German citizens. And the assumption is that none of them are Jews. Because when they do religion, and they do, it is Lutheran, Calvinist, Catholic. Those are your choices. So there might be confessionslos. I'll have to look that up. But yeah, I don't think the assumption was that Jews were surveyed. And there's, I thought there was another question way in the back. It looks like Johannes. I can recognize him even from that far away.
Yeah. I have a question about expertise.
Yeah.
Namely, what if the German press ever asks experts on Zionism or the Jewish question, where do they come from? Because both in the interwar period, the Jewish and the state education system actually produced experts on Jewish history and on Zionism.
Yeah.
There was a Nazi chapter in Palestine by the Templars.
Right.
There were Nazi newspapers sending people to look at Zionism in the 1930s. Right. Are these experts on Zionism ever appearing in the press?
Well, I think that the newspapers after World War II would not have much interest in interviewing a Nazi Fachmann. Right. That's not acceptable. When they interview Jews, they're not necessarily Jewish experts. It might be, a leader in the Frankfurt community or a rabbi from somewhere, and they just happen to be Jewish people of some prominence in that small community that remains in Germany after the war. But the experts themselves, who you're referring to, do not make an appearance in the sources I looked at. And there was a question then also in the middle here. Yes.
I was wondering about the relationship between these, not necessarily these comments, but the whole take of Germany towards Israel to what later on is called Staatsräson.
Right.
I mean, you mentioned it a little bit because Adenauer knew very well of, about the problems, the views, the anti-Semitic views in the society, and he had to act against it when he came to produce the Wiedergutmachung or these ideas. So have you found any relationship to, a change of policy towards Israel and these kind of popular notions?
Well, not this early on. Again, this is a talk that just dealt with the very beginning. And there's lots and lots of books on German-Israel relations. They all start in 1949. But there's one, if you're interested in the high politics and how and when Germany does begin to, it's not just recognition of Israel, it's not just diplomatic relations, which it's a rather slow and complicated story, but also military assistance. That's Carol Fink, Carol with an E, and Fink, F-I-N-K. her book on German-Israeli relations, I think, goes into this beautifully and explains how really already in the mid-1960s, Germany is providing Israel with armaments. And I mean, the relationship with the state is much closer than what the German people themselves necessarily want or are necessarily aware of, because a lot of it's secret and it comes out later. Now, there is many of you probably know better than I do, there is the change in German public opinion towards Israel, which begins in the late 60s, accelerates in the 1970s, and there's some very good synthetic work on survey data from, again, this much later period that shows Germans becoming increasingly sympathetic to Jews, sympathetic to Israel, and then you have the period where Germans are traveling to Israel extensively, young Germans are going to Israel to work in hospitals or in old folks' homes or whatever. I don't remember, Johannes might know, the year in which Operation Sünderzeichen was founded. Sorry? 58. Okay, so it begins in 58, and then in the 60s it really takes off. And then we get the more solidly philo-Semitic association between Germans and Israel, certainly by the mid to late 1970s. It's very strong, but even earlier. So I am talking about a different historical period. To explain this moment before the creation of the German state, when the sources become more available and everybody starts writing their books about Germany and Israel. I see, it looks like Dan has a question. I guess we should let him ask a question.
It's actually a refinement of or a follow-on from the question that was just asked. Did you find many comments by essentially the pre-statehood, pre-sovereignty elites, political elites on this issue? Does Ernst Reuter say anything? Does Schumacher say anything? Does Adenauer say anything? It would be interesting to see how they're triangulating between international audiences and domestic audiences.
It's a terrific question, and I scoured Adenauer's letters for this, because of course his letters have been published in multiple volumes. And what's fascinating is that Israel only appears once or twice. There's a famous, I guess it was an interview that Adenauer gave to a West German Jewish newspaper in 1948, and he talks about German responsibility, but that's once. And then there is, and again, Adenauer experts will probably know this, there was an exchange with a Catholic priest who was going to write a highly defensive piece for, I forget if it was in Bonn, but he was going to write a very defensive piece for a German newspaper, essentially arguing that the Roman Catholic Church knew nothing about the Holocaust. And Adenauer upbraids him. And he uses the most impolitic language. And the Catholic Church was responsible, it was guilty, you supported Hitler, you made it possible. And it's interesting because otherwise, volume after volume, letter after letter, this kind of subject never appears. I figured maybe Jaspers would have written about it, and then I looked through the Jaspers Hannah Arendt correspondence, because Hannah Arendt is writing extensively about the creation of the Jewish state. The word Israel or Palestine never appears once in their correspondence. So I think there's a very strong separation here between what's happening on the ground, Israel-Palestine, and the way that the political elite or the intellectual elite is trying to think through the future of Germany. It's a puzzle for me, and I don't have it completely figured out. So if anybody has possible hypotheses, I would be delighted to hear them. I think there was another question, again, kind of in the middle. Oh, yeah. And then we can go just straight back several rows from there.
Just a quick question, because the communist reaction, the pro-Zionist position of the communists is very striking, because from my understanding, it is the Soviets that were very pro-Israel, or Zionism. So I was just wondering if there was this sort of association of Stalinists, the Stalinists sort of, channeling support to the communists and influencing that debate. And this brings to also the question, what do the East Germans think?
Yeah. So again, there's no East Germany then. Again, we're 1948. East Germany doesn't exist. What does exist is the communist, the communist newspaper. Berliner Zeitung was at that time. It's it's a communist newspaper that reflects the views of the Soviet Union. And all of these communist publications I looked at, even to the point where one in Argentina that I read talks about how Israel and the Soviet Union will be the natural allies against Yankee imperialism. Whatever your enemy is. Oh, and also, you see this in the Eastern German, I should say, not East Germany, because there is no East Germany yet. In the Eastern German press, what you see is a statement that there is no disagreement between the Arabs of Palestine and the Jews of Palestine. The disagreement is being created by capitalist elites or feudal elites who are trying to foment dissent between brethren, right? They're just making this up. So, and yes, it's very much coming from, this is very much a Moscow-directed discourse, completely. You're totally right. And there was a question a few rows back in back of you. Yeah, you see the hand up.
Thank you very much. I was taught to stand when I ask questions, sorry. Raised by nuns. So my question is, in Dernhoff's piece, she makes an explicit reference to, obviously, the assassination of Bernadotte.
Yeah.
What, if any other coverage, I mean, I realize you said that it's mostly just wire, so it might just be very matter-of-factual, but if not matter-of-factual and a little bit more expanded, what, if any, other reports were made on the activities of like the Stern Gang, Lehi, other paramilitary or terrorist activity in Palestine at the same time?
Sure.
And how did that influence public opinion, if there's any evidence?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question because it's amazing what you can do with wire services. You know, first of all, how much attention you pay to something, how little attention. There are many different wire services at this time. And you can splice things together. And of course, the East Germans are using, or the communists in what will become Eastern Germany are using a Soviet wire service. And how you blend the news together, how much attention you pay. So the assassination of Volker Bernadotte, the UN-appointed mediator, who was assassinated in mid-September of 1948 by Jewish extremists in what was known as Lehi, Lochmei Lecherut Yisrael. It was a far right-wing, well, it's so extreme that it's neither far right-wing nor far left-wing. It's both. It's just extreme. And it receives extensive coverage. The assassination of Bernadotte is one of these events that covers, I guess, a lot of coverage. And what also gets covered extensively, to answer your question directly, is condemnation of the so-called dissident or extreme groups. So what you'll have is the wire service will quote, let's say, the mainstream Jewish provisional government at the time, condemning what was known as the Irgun, one of the larger of the two dissident militias, or the Stern Gang. So these groups appear to be condemned. And this offers the young state of Israel a chance to separate any misdeeds it commits by saying, well, that's not our fault, it's their fault. The Stern Gang assassinates Bernadotte, or a Lord Moyne in Egypt, or the massacre in Deir Yassin in April of 1948, and so forth, a famous massacre of Palestinian civilians. And what the newspapers are really doing, and this is part of a global phenomenon, it's not just Germany, is they are incorporating a labor Zionist narrative of who is responsible for misdeeds or who is responsible for atrocities in Palestine. And this is something that becomes really widely accepted. So yes, Lehi, or the Stern Gang, is covered an awful lot. And just to mention a non-German source, there was a Swiss journalist whose name now is escaping me, who went to Palestine in 1949 and wrote a book about it. And in the book, he ends the book with a Irgun meeting, but it's actually somewhere back in Switzerland. And he talks about the language that they're employing, the anger, the aggressiveness. And he basically says in this circumlocucious way that they're talking like Nazis, right? Which I think is a bit unfair. But so yes, the notion of the extremist Zionists gets a lot of attention in the press worldwide, including Germany. Yes, please.
Did you find evidence in your in the writings you were reading that Germans did not consider Jews to be German citizens? Actually, that's a notion in the German society that lived up until sometimes even today, where they would always think you could be either German or you could be Jew. You could not be both, not a Jewish German or a German Jew.
I don't see it explicitly in the journalistic coverage and in the surveys. I mean, I think it's implicit if they see Jews as so malevolent and so dangerous to the German body politic that these people cannot be, right? They are not part of us. They are seen as somehow malevolent and harmful to us. So I think that's what they're getting at. I think, Stephen, you had have to make sure that my colleagues.
Perhaps the last question?
That's fine. Whatever you want.
I have a two-part question about academia.
Yeah.
First part has to do with what you were talking about, the question of guilt and the deafening silence among academics in the 50s and beyond about their colleagues who had very clearly been embroiled in anti-Semitic work and politics. And the second part has to do with your comments about the 60s and the 70s and the pro-Israeli sentiments, which when I was a student here, I did not sense among the members of the far left.
No, not among the far left.
That was a pretty strong sentiment. So it was the opposite in the sense of the trend that you were describing.
Yeah, were you by any chance here in like 77, 78?
Yes.
Okay, so that's when I was here. And yeah, if you were in the student circles, if you were in the Mensa at the Technische Universität, or you didn't see a whole lot of We Love Israel posters. It was quite the opposite. But at the time I was living with a German family, they were very CDU, they read the Springer newspapers, and they didn't know I was Jewish. When I moved in with them, they found out, and it really unnerved them. And they would tell me about how much they had suffered during the war, but they would also clip out little articles from the Bild-Zeitung. They would clip out little articles about about the Israeli Air Force and about what great, so this is now 10 years after the 1967 wars, during the time of the very brief invasion of Lebanon in 78, but basically about how wonderful the Israeli military was and how supportive they were of Israel. And later I found out about my landlord's past, which was unsavory. So yeah, it was a defensive action. So I think it just depends on who you're hanging out with. And as far as academics who behaved dishonorably during the 1930s and 40s, or who then stood silent when dealing with other academics who behaved dishonorably, I'm not sure if academics by nature are any more ethical or moral than anybody else. They might be more intelligent or more clever, but I'm not surprised that there was a spectrum of moral behavior. So, okay.